Hello, everyone. This is the third recording for a class on early Greek philosophy. Today, I want to talk about Thales, whose main philosophical view seems to be that everything is out of water. Now, the reconstruction of this term out of leads us to think about causes, and that leads us to Aristotle's metaphysics. So here is a famous passage in chapter 3 of Metaphysics Alpha, book 1 of the Metaphysics. Aristotle says that Thales is the founder of a certain way of doing natural philosophy. Note what he doesn't say. He does not say that Thales is the founder of philosophy. He also doesn't say that Thales is the founder of natural philosophy. He makes a more modest claim, as it were. Thales is the founder of a certain way of doing natural philosophy. So, what is this way of doing natural philosophy? According to Aristotle, Thales belongs to a group of early thinkers who talk only about, in Aristotle's terms, material principles. And Thales is special among these others by positing only one such material principle, namely water. And then Aristotle gives us a little bit of an elucidation of what it means that something is a material principle. He says that, well, that means that which is the material principle is that out of which things are, and it is that out of which things come to be, and it is also that into which things fall apart, as it were, when they are destroyed. So here's what we have. According to Aristotle, Thales says that matter is the material principle. But now we need to pause and ask ourselves, how much of this claim is likely to come from Thales and how much of this claim comes from Aristotle? There are two notions involved here, which are technical notions in Aristotle's philosophy, principle and matter. So let me talk a little bit more about this. In Metaphysics Alpha, Aristotle wants to think through the views of earlier philosophers in order to see whether they come up on his reading with any kind of cause or principle that does not fit into Aristotle's own distinction between four kinds of first causes and principles. So what are these four kinds of causes and principles? Matter, the efficient cause, the formal cause, and the final cause. And Aristotle, as it were, wants to show that no one came up with anything that does not fit into or is not captured by his own comprehensive theory. So Aristotle is not doing history of philosophy here, and he is not a doxographer. He is engaged in his own philosophical project. And hence we need to ask how much of his report about Thales is in fact a report about Thales, as opposed to a kind of rethinking of what he takes Thales to have said within his own framework, and that is within Aristotle's framework. The notion of a principle is extraordinarily important for Aristotle because he himself is interested in these first principles and causes. And when Aristotle says that many of these early philosophers talk especially about material things, he's kind of quite convincing, and a lot of readers and even scholars over the centuries have been convinced by this. And it is quite recently only that scholars have noted that it is in fact quite rare that early philosophers talk about matter, hyle. Instead, they often talk about corporeals, somata, bodily things. So we should really be cautious and think that matter is also a technical notion in Aristotle's philosophy. Now, let's ask what remains of Thales' claim if we, as it were, take out of the picture the two notions that we have recognized as distinctively Aristotelian: principle, arche, on the one hand, matter, hyle, on the other hand. Well, then what remains is that everything is out of water. And now we can ask, well, what can we make of this if we don't use Aristotle's distinction between kinds of causes, but maybe one that is plausible to us. What are we going to say? And maybe then we want to introduce a distinction between what I'm going to call a constitutive cause versus a generative cause. So if Thales were to talk about a constitutive cause, then he would say that water is that out of which, as it were, in the final analysis, everything consists. Fundamentally, everything consists of water. That would be one way of reading his claim. Another way of reading his claim would be that water is the generative source of everything. Water is where everything comes from. And then we can introduce further distinctions and we can ask, for example, well, if it were such a generative cause, would it be just temporally at the beginning? Or would it be maybe contemporaneous with things throughout time, such that it nourishes and sustains things? And so on and so forth. So we can then, as it were, think through things, introducing, to some extent, our own distinctions. Now, I want to leave things here and just treat this as a kind of methodological illustration of what we need to do when we deal with reports about early Greek philosophers that are as philosophically rich as Metaphysics Alpha. We need to think, to some extent, not only about the early Greek philosophers, we also need to think about Aristotle, such that we see which notions are likely to be Aristotle's framing versus genuinely part of the early view that he discusses. And then we can, as it were, try to make sense of things, both with a view to the framework that Aristotle employs and with a view to distinctions that we may want to invoke.